Hello, World Internet, and Jason Isaacs, and welcome back to my discussion of feminism. This is part three of a series of three videos investigating feminism. We looked at an introduction, and then in part two, we looked at liberalism and socialism, and now we're moving on to radical feminism. So do make sure that you check out my two earlier videos. I'll link off to them in the footnotes. But when you've done that, we'll come back. We'll talk about radical feminism. We'll start off by saying, well, what is radical about radical feminism? And the answer to that is challenge everything. Radical feminism looks at the very foundations of our society, the very foundations of our economic model, the very foundations, indeed, of our assumption of human nature, and says, well, what is it about this? How does this oppress women? What is it about this particular understanding or agreement or situation that means that men can oppress women, and what can we do to change it? So we start off with our very picture of human nature. That's going to then inform our versions of society and the economy, and the state is going to take its lead from those and have a job sustaining and managing those two particular structures. Right, so radical feminism and human nature. We start from the premise that men and women should at least have moral and political parity. At the minute, they don't. This is again the foundational point at which radical feminism and feminism in general comes in. But radical feminism goes further, and it says that the patriarchy is so entrenched that we have a psychological position that oppresses women. Our version of what normal is inherently oppressive. Women are essentially disadvantaged before the game even starts. And what we've got here is a situation whereby the presumption of the patriarchy is essentially inculcated into our understanding of what human nature is. We're in a situation that is equivalent effectively to a false consciousness, the false consciousness that's talked about in our socialist models, whereby we say, look, you think that your reality is this, but in truth it is something else entirely. So the idea here is that radical feminism looks at human nature and says that we have essentially bought into an idea whereby we have a hierarchy that even at a subliminal or at a subconscious level, humanity has bought into it a sense of order between the sexes, and men are very much first, and that is part now of our general thinking. Human nature, men and women are at least equal, but our understanding of that has become distorted by the patriarchy, so that we naturally presume a higher order for men. And tackling that has got to be the first thing I think that radical feminism seeks to do. That we have to recognize that our understanding of normal is distorted. Our understanding of human nature is distorted. And this is both men and women, that we are both coming at it from a position whereby our understanding of what is normal is slightly skewed by virtue of being a product essentially of a patriarchal society. So we have to start with our definition of what normal is. What is it to be normal? We start again with society, and we would take that again, this idea that the patriarchy has extended so far that it's not enough to change public institutions. The patriarchy is getting at us at a foundational level, therefore we need to go in at the foundations of our society, and the foundations of the society are the family. And radical feminism looks at the family model that we have and says, hang on, does it have to be like that? The traditional family presumes traditional roles of men and of women. Do they have to be like that? No, again, is the argument. Those roles are inherently oppressive. And if we start from an oppressive beginning, then we're going to get to an oppressive end. So we need to challenge those initial assumptions of the quote-unquote nuclear family. If we look at that and we find evidence of the patriarchy, then we rip that out. And I argue, I use this phrase in one of my earlier presentations, that the patriarchy begins at home. And if you're a product of a patriarchal society, then essentially that becomes your hardware, that becomes your natural instinct, and we need to rip that out. So again, what's radical about radical feminism? The patriarchal society is inherently corrupt. It's entirely derelict. It is essentially, what's the word I'm looking for? Not deranged. It's beyond redemption. Essentially, it has to be replaced. And it has to be replaced on a system that starts from a different place. So we have to look again at our idea of the family. Are we going to go down that road? We're not necessarily going to prescribe a single outcome. And again, this is somewhere where the book, I think, goes into the textbook, and by which one I mean this textbook here, kind of gets dragged into the weeds because it gets obsessed about different forms of feminism and different societal models. I don't think that's really what you're going to be examined on. What you're going to be examined on is less how radical feminists propose to create a better society, and more along the lines of identifying the problem so that they can actually start that process. We identify the problem, and then downstream we can worry about how we rebuild our society afterwards. The specific problem with society is that society is distorted towards the patriarchy. Society is a false construct that takes its lead from a false construct, or not necessarily true construct. And so we're going to evaluate it root and branch. We're going to start with the family, and we're going to challenge everything. We're going to challenge every assumption in that society. And if we find that our society is beyond redemption, if we find that it is entirely corrupted and degenerate, then we need to rebuild a society. We need to rebuild a society on some non-patriarchal, presumably matriarchal grounds. We don't need necessarily to get into what that looks like. We just need to rip out the patriarchy and reassess at that point. And exactly the same with the economy. The capitalism, I think the critical point here is the way in which capitalism feeds upon insecurity. Our societal model breeds insecurity, particularly in women, and that is then put to the advantage of a capitalist economy. You can go further and say that, if women are more inclined towards cooperation than they are towards individualism, as some feminists would argue, then they're always going to be disadvantaged by a capitalist society. But having sort of prepared this slide and having discussed it with some of my students, we got into the idea, again, that idea that capitalism feeds on insecurities, that we are... capitalism will say, okay, you're feeling inadequate, you're feeling empty, well, we can fill it with stuff. And no more so is this true when it projects an image of women, where society, or where our patriarchal society projects an image of an ideal to which no one can aspire, let's face it, and then says, well, okay, this is your ideal, you're all falling short of it, but hey, look, you can buy stuff and it will help you get towards that ideal. So whether it's makeup or high heels or Spanx, it doesn't really matter. What we're saying is, here's an impossible ideal, but you can aspire towards it by participating in this capitalist society. So capitalism feeds upon insecurities. The patriarchy feeds those insecurities into the model, and women, because they're oppressed by society, believe that they can achieve some form of fulfillment through this capitalist model by buying stuff that will make them happy or that will help them fulfill an entirely arbitrary and unrealistic ideal. We're kind of drifting off the subject here, but you can see how radical feminists would look at our economy and say, this is wrong. It's feeding upon women's insecurities that are generated or that are inculcated in them by a patriarchal model that says you need to conform to this particular stereotype, and if you don't, then you are somehow falling short. When it comes to radical feminism and the state, again, it's that idea that the state is degenerate, the state reflects the patriarchy, the state is no longer a neutral agent of change, and so basically we have to rip it out. Again, the book gets dragged into the weeds on what sort of matriarchal state you might want. That's fascinating, and that's a conversation for another day. I think the real issue here is the way in which we identify the problem. And the problem is the way in which the patriarchy has invaded into the state and corrupted it beyond all redemption. We need to rip it out, and we need to start again along lines that will prevent the oppression of women and allow for the emancipation of women. So no single alternative prescribed. I think if you find yourself discussing different models of matriarchal society, you're probably in the weeds, or maybe you're at university, in which case, brilliant, carry on. But in the A level, I think it's more important that we recognize the problem, that we identify the problem, and the solution is to rip it all out and start again along some non-specific lines designed to prevent the oppression of women and allow for the emancipation of women. Right. Postmodern feminism, it's complicated, or rather it's not complicated, in that what it says is to reduce the oppression of women to a straight binary thing, to men versus women, is to overlook many, many different forms of women's oppression and many different levels of women's oppression. We can look at other things that affect women, or perhaps affect particularly women, such as class, race, religion, and of course LGBT. That should have been a Q. I'm not sure where the A came from, and other forms of again, it's not prescriptive. It says, look, you can't look at this simply as a binary thing between men and women, because let's face it, a lot of particularly white middle class heterosexual Christian women are doing pretty well out of the patriarchy, or certainly there are other people who are doing less well out of the patriarchy. Those from minority backgrounds will be doing even worse than your white middle class heterosexual etc. women, and so what we need to look at is this idea of intersectionality, that within the general oppression of women there are some many more nuanced ways in which particular types of women, particular women of particular classes or particular races or particular religions or particular sexual orientation, are being further repressed by the system. It's not a straight binary thing. We need to look at the bigger picture, or as the postmodern feminists would argue, we need to look at the intersectionality of these things. It's not a simple binary men versus women thing. And that's about as much as I've got for you at this point. There's been a couple of brilliant articles in The Guardian recently on feminism. There's been a fantastic one in Prospect, and I'll make sure I link off to all of those in the footnotes to this, along with notes to all of the other videos. Do let me know how you're finding these. Do let me know if they're helpful. Do let me know if I've got something terribly wrong here. I wouldn't be the first time. I remember making a mistake before. Yep. So let me know. I'm sure you will. And again, let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to cover. But we're done now for feminism. I look forward to your questions, and good luck, everybody. See you all soon, I hope. All the best.